We got to get out of this place. How about the moon? I'm Scott Ott, and this episode of Bill Whittle Now is brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. Bill, NASA has awarded some more contracts, this time to Jeff Bezos' organization, Blue Origin, to Elon Musk's organization, SpaceX, and to one that I hadn't previously heard of called Dynetics, which is a division of Leidos, Leidos, a Reston, Virginia-based information technology company. All of these if I understand the story correctly, essentially for a lunar lander. This is for the craft that will put the astronauts down on the moon when we return to the moon in 2024. That has been an accelerated deadline. It was 2028 we were shooting for, but Vice President Pence apparently single-handedly said, let's speed that up. I doubt it was single-handedly. Bill, this poses some interesting questions, I think, and I know this is an area you're excited about because, among other things, you're a space kid. You did that 4-part documentary series, Apollo 11, What We Saw, and which can be seen, by the way, at BillWhittle.com. Just go to the website and scroll to the bottom of the page. You'll find the link to the whole series. So Blue Origin's getting $579 million in this contract that runs through February 2021. SpaceX is at the low end at $135 million. And then this company Dynetics, $253 million. By February 2021, it's possible that all three of them will be awarded ongoing contracts, or that they may go with just 2 out of the 3. And I guess the first question that occurred to me, Bill, after I got over my childlike excitement because of my birth date, basically, is at a time like this, do you think people look at the awarding of hundreds of millions of dollars in contracts to go to the moon and say, yeah, that's the best thing that the government could do with our money as our economy is collapsing and a disease is ravaging the land?
Well, to say not is to say that this is the end of civilization, and I refuse to go down that road. I've never, to say, no, we can't spend money now on the future. We can't do this. We can't do that. We're in the middle of a pandemic that may last forever. Our economy's about to collapse. I don't buy any of that stuff. And I think if Americans did buy into that stuff, it wouldn't be America anymore. I not only do I not think this needs to be postponed, I think it is way, 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 way overdue. And I think it'd be nice to have something for Americans to look forward to, other than new fights with Congress or new attempts to impeach the president or whatever the case may be.
There's an interesting naming in this mission. The mission is being referred to overall as Artemis, which is the twin sister of Apollo in mythology. It may make you also wonder, not only, hey, that's kind of clever, but here we are, what is this, 40-some years later, and trying to go back and do something that our ancestors already did. Do you think we're being motivated largely by nostalgia here? No.
In fact, I think quite the opposite. The first thing that's striking about the three candidates is not the three candidates, and like you, I've obviously heard of Blue Origins and SpaceX, and I haven't heard of the third company, but that makes me extremely happy. What's noticeable, first of all, is by not who's in that final 3, but who's not. Who's not in the final 3?
Boeing.
Lockheed Martin, Northrop.
Now, they have roles in this process, and I believe, and you probably know this better than I do, but if I took the story correctly, Boeing is essentially still in the launch vehicle company.
Yes, they've got a capsule, but a recent NASA review found that of 4 proposals, I don't know if it was for the moon landing or for advancing the ability to get to orbit, that of the 4 proposals submitted, Boeing was by far the least bang for the buck. And it pains me to say that because Boeing has done a tremendous job with aviation, but it doesn't surprise me. And it only pains me to say that out of nostalgia for Boeing. But the fact of the matter is, this is precisely exactly capitalism at its best, where a company that started out with, I think the Boeing, the Lockheed brothers, and all these Boeing, Cessna, Lear, Hughes, Northrop, these are all named after individual guys. And over the course of 3/4 of a century, these companies have gotten bigger and bigger, and they were in their prime for decades. But now they've grown fossilized and slow and expensive and meek.
Now that you say that, Bill, it's interesting because, all of those companies that you listed named after their individual founders. And yet, while we have these rock star founders like Elon Musk of SpaceX and Jeff Bezos of Amazon.com, as well as of Blue Origin, they're not named after their founders. Are we just in a different era now where you don't do that kind of thing? Or is there something fundamentally different about business?
Well, for both. We are in a different era. We are in an era where that kind of individuality is frowned upon, but nevertheless, it's that kind of individuality that's making this stuff happen. Bigelow is a company that's been working on inflatable habitats for orbital use, basically a space hotel, and that's named after its founder, who made a lot of money in Earth-based hotels. But as a general rule, they don't. And I think I happen to say that the names that they've chosen, I think, are terrific names. I think Blue Origin, SpaceX, the logos, the iconography, Blue Origin's a feather. SpaceX has got a tremendous graphic thing. So part of that is just the effect of graphic design on business over the last 50 or 60 years. But it's extremely, extremely notable that the big three are not among the final three. None of them are. And that gives me a great deal of confidence, not only that this will be done, but that it'll be done on time.
Now, if
because because whatever the number was, $270 million or something for this company in West Virginia is enough money for them to move on their plans. $270 million for $253 million for Boeing or Grumman or Northrop is what they would charge to study the problem. And that would take 3 years. So this is capitalism at its best, where companies that get too old, too big, too slow, too overconfident are having their lunch handed to them by younger, faster, leaner, lighter companies. And Apple's a perfect example of this in the electronics field.
And it certainly isn't. I mean, if you looked at government contracts as a way of producing jobs, you would have given the money to Boeing because they're the people that have the giant workforce. And, let's redistribute the wealth over to Boeing because we know that'll employ a lot of people. And instead, this company Dynetics, out of nowhere for most of us, comes up with this contract, and relatively lean and scrappy organizations like Blue Origin and SpaceX.
Small.
Yeah, and it's the mindset of the industrial era really says, you've got to have many, many thousands of people puzzling through these issues and working out every detail. And especially if you're going to put human lives in bombs that fly and send them to the moon.
Well, that's not their primary intent.
Being a bomb, you mean?
Yeah, but that's what they are. And listen, I'll tell you who deserves a lot of credit for this, because you raise an interesting point. It's not just the government taking a risk on smaller companies and spending money on them. You have to think about the political pressure to give it to larger companies because of the whole pork idea. I represent the district that Boeing has 80,000 employees. I haven't got the faintest idea what the number is. But Nevertheless, those throw a lot of weight politically and have traditionally been the way that contracts have been awarded throughout the space program and so on. So not only is it a smart way to spend money, it's also politically brave. And a great deal of the credit of this goes to Mike Pence, and the credit that Mike Pence gets is largely due to Donald Trump giving Mike Pence his head on this. I have been peripherally involved on the outskirts of some of the planning for the kind of Space Race 2 kind of thing, and the thinking is very, very out of the box, very fresh, and I am delighted that these three companies were chosen, because they are not only showing that they can do it, but they're showing they can do it a lot less expensively, and they're showing that they can do it on time. This is my biggest concern. If they'd given it to Boeing, it wouldn't even have been a question of, hey, it's just if they had given this money to Boeing or Lockheed for a 2024 landing, we would see a landing in 2031. And that's just, I have no doubt about that at all, none. So,
and we did a recent show about SpaceX planning to launch astronauts to the International Space Station. The current date is May 27, 2020. This will be the first manned from the United States space flight to the International Space Station in almost a decade.
And to give you a quick idea of the kind of the out-of-the-box thinking that is entailed here, the original design for the Dragon capsule that Elon Musk and SpaceX put forward didn't have an escape tower. The escape tower is the spindly thing you would see on the top of American rockets, and they've got them on top of Soviet rockets as well, and Chinese rockets too. And that escape tower is basically a solid rocket motor, or a number of them. And if it turns out there's an on-the-pad emergency, or there's an explosion in midair or something, this escape tower pulls the crew capsule out of the way, brings it back down, and parachutes it back down to Earth. Now, SpaceX originally didn't want one of those on there because they said that the window of usefulness for this was so small, and the weight was so large that it actually reduced safety. And I thought that was a compelling argument. But NASA said no escape tower, then you're out of consideration. But here's the part that's fascinating to me. So when SpaceX realized they had to have an escape tower, they didn't build an escape tower. They built 4 rocket engines into the side of the capsule. They can land the capsule that way. They can land it. They're not going to. They're going to splash down in the ocean for a while. But as I understand it, that escape system is not just a literally throwaway system where, a minute into launch or a little less than, it just disappears. They're saying, well, if you're going to make us put the weight of an escape capsule on this thing, why don't we use those same rockets to be able to land the capsule on a dime? And this kind of thing.
Trying to imagine NASA being in charge of the first manned flight efforts. And, you're talking to some bureaucrat in Washington, D.C., and he's like, wait a minute, did you say the guy's head would be outside of the vehicle while you're flying at 1,000 feet?
Yeah. Exactly. And I would like to say one thing about the nostalgia aspect of it, because this Space Race 2 is very, very, very different than Space Race 1, which was won by a government agency, NASA, coordinating any number of private companies. This one's very different, and this one is going to be profit-based. No one is going to the moon to impress the Chinese or anybody else. We did that 2 generations ago, did it 50 years ago. Our grandparents did that. By the way, just to give you an idea of how well Apollo did that, every single one of the people that walked on the moon died of old age.
The youngest one. It's interesting you bring that up. I just saw an interview or read an interview with Michael Collins, who said that the whole Russia space race element of what they were engaged in at that time was a very small part of what they ever thought about. I mean, he said certainly there were people thinking about that, and certainly John F. Kennedy's motivating call to get to the moon and bring the crew back safely before the decade is out was motivational. But he said maybe 99% of the time we were thinking about other things.
Absolutely right. And that's a really great point. I'm glad you brought it up. Whatever reason that the moon mission may have been given, certainly in the very early days of the space program, with the Mercury astronauts wanting to fly and watching the Russians beat them, that was a lot more on the radar. But by the time you get to Apollo, it's like, oh yeah, the Russians, yeah, okay, well, we got more things to worry about than what they're doing. We're going to just go as fast as we can. But I want to come back to the moon for a minute, because a lot of people think, oh, well, the moon, we've already been to the moon. Why don't we just push on to Mars? The moon is of incredible value to a permanent presence in space. And if I had a choice of going to building a moon base or doing 5 independent expeditions to Mars, I'd take the moon base every time, because the moon base will allow you to go to Mars whenever you want to and everywhere else as well. Little under 98%, I think, of the total energy needed to get to the moon is needed to get out of Earth, to get into Earth orbit, to get out of the gravity of the Earth and the atmosphere of the Earth. So you are basically, if you can build things on the moon and launch them from the moon, it is almost indescribably easier than getting it out of this super thick gravity well that also has air resistance that you have to fight. So the moon is where we need to be for the future. And if we can make a permanent presence on the moon, then that is the key to the entire solar system. And if we don't build a presence on the moon and we do these one-off missions to Mars, then we'll have the chance to plant the flag and walk around and do all that other stuff, which is nice, but we won't be there to stay until we are on the moon to stay. And the moon, every single day we learn more and more and more about just how valuable the moon is. We still don't know exactly how much water might be locked up in the poles, in the craters on the poles, but water is useful stuff.
And that's one of the early tests that they're going to do when they do land on the moon. They're going to be looking for that. There are some dark places that they can't really see into very effectively, and they want to be able to research that and see whether water or other kinds of minerals.
Yeah, there's a large crater on the south pole of the moon, and the crater walls are high enough so that the sun has never touched that soil. And we know there's ice there. We don't know how much, but if you take water ice and you run some electricity through it, you get hydrogen, which is the perfect rocket fuel, and you get oxygen, which is kind of nice to breathe. So the more water we find on the moon, the faster we'll be able to move. But even things like Ceres, the largest asteroid in the solar system, conceivably has more water in it than the Earth does. I mean, it might be completely water on the inside. And water is the key. Where we can find water, we can go back and forth with impunity. If we have to take our own water, it gets a lot more difficult. But not only is it
the task of an explorer has never really changed. I mean, long distance travel on foot used to be contingent upon your ability to find places where you could stop and get water.
And your giant voyages of discovery around the world in the 1500s, those were predicated that the longest distance you could sail was how long your water could last. You had to find places to get water. And since water is not only part of oxygen, it's also fuel, you also draw an analogy to how far you could go without coaling stations. They put coaling stations all around the world for these fleets that burn these huge amounts of coal. So if we don't have to take our own fuel with us, if we can find our fuel at the destination, meaning hydrogen and oxygen, then we're golden. And the point that needs to be mentioned is that one of the very few asteroids that we've had a chance to study without actually going to, but you'll understand why we paid such attention to this. Most asteroids are rocky and dusty, and they're basically collections of just rubble that's holding together under very weak gravity and has a surface layer of dust on it. But some of them are solid rock, and some of them are solid rock and have minerals, metals in them. And there's an asteroid out there, and a reasonable estimate of the amount of platinum in that asteroid is $5 trillion. Getting stuff up is exceedingly difficult. Getting stuff down is a piece of cake. So when you're looking at a $5 trillion mine, not a $5 billion mine, $5,000 billion of platinum on this rock out there, which you can mine with impunity, with no environmental impact, because there is no environment. There's nothing more harsh than the environment of space. So you go up there and you come back with $5 trillion. Now, for people who think...
When that mining ship takes off, I'm selling all of my stock of platinum because it'll be...
Your vast holdings, yeah, me
it'll
too.
be worthless when they get back.
Well, it will certainly drop the value of platinum, but all of these things are things that we need for electronics. And so my point is this. If one rock out there is worth $5 trillion, the impact on Earth's economy could be the same impact on the world economy that the discovery of the New World made. I mean, if you take the entire Western Hemisphere off of the planet now and think about how much poorer the world would be, you get some idea of what's out there. And we have to be following economic concerns, because if we don't, then everything that went wrong with Space Program 1 will happen. Congress will start to scale back budgets, and people will complain about the money that's being spent, and beautifully elegant designs will be band-aided and engineered and worked back and down and down and down and made less and less safe. If you do this for money and you're making money, then you have the difference between a youth hostel in East Germany versus a five-star hotel in Monte Carlo.
Well, and I was being facetious, obviously, about the platinum thing, but it's facetious based on things I've read in comments on other videos. And it occurred to me, and I didn't engage with the people who were saying this, Bill, but it occurred to me that what happens when you suddenly have a supply of something that you didn't have before is innovation. Yes, it'll drive
right.
the per ounce price of it or per pound at that point, price of it downward. But, think about the fact that when we didn't have a lot of petroleum, or it wasn't easy to get out of the ground, or wasn't easy to refine and all that kind of stuff, the availability of petroleum made possible a whole new world. And I think the same thing will happen.
Let me just give you the big payoff for the moon. One of the most likely candidates for nuclear fusion, unlike fission, which is the nuclear plants that we have today, fusion produces no radioactive byproducts. It generates pure energy. And it cannot explode. It cannot fail. Enormous pressures have to be put into this thing to make it fuse. And if the electricity goes out, it just doesn't. It stops. So fusion is the answer for a clean energy future. And fusion is enormously powerful. It's all the energy we could ever want. You could, honest to God, if you got fusion down, you could air condition outdoors. Your electricity bill would be zero. And now one of the primary fuels for fusion, I'm almost sure it's helium-3, but it's a isotope of helium, is very rare on the Earth. And it is especially uniquely suited to be a good target for fusion fuel. But by happy coincidence, the millennia of solar radiation that strikes the surface of the moon means that the entire moon, all of it, is covered in helium-3. It's just covered. And all you have to do is just take a giant tractor and scoop it up. And when you get to that kind of thing, when you talk about innovation, you want to talk about improving the world and changing the world. One of the likely early byproducts of being on the moon, and the really important byproducts we can't imagine yet. We just can't imagine them. But one of the early ones could be the idea of unlimited, clean, safe energy. Let me make sure everybody heard that. Unlimited, clean, safe energy.
I'm against it, but I don't know why yet.
Well, that means you can do what we thought we were going to do with nuclear fission, that means you can have fusion-powered pumps running fusion-powered desalination plants, and you can irrigate and grow rice outside of Vegas if you want to, and there's no reason not to. So the moon is where we need to be, and if I had to pick a permanent presence on the moon that's what I would pick. Anyway, and it's going to get done by American private companies.
Was that we're going to put a man on the moon and bring him back safely. What they're saying now is we're going to the moon to stay. And that doesn't mean that every individual goes up there is going to stay there forever. But the idea goes from being essentially a researcher or almost a tourist stopping for a short visit to, hey, we're establishing a foothold here. We're going to build cities. We're going to build industrial operations. We're going to build launch pads there to go elsewhere. And Bill, it strikes me that all of this is happening under the, even though it's a private sector driven thing, but NASA has still had a very active hand in this. And the NASA administrator, when he was named by this president of the United States, was treated as a laughingstock. If I remember correctly, Jim Bridenstine was like a congressman from Texas. Mm-hmm. And I saw him speak one time, and I thought, oh, well, he's a relatively ordinary guy and gives an okay politician speech. And now he's running NASA, and he's got a childlike enthusiasm for this stuff, and has managed to keep this ball moving forward with the help, obviously, of Pence and all the private sector people. Does it strike you as unusual that sort of the least likely, not very scientific guy who's heading up NASA is now running NASA at a time when it's probably more excitement here than there's been in 40 years?
The reason they laughed at him was because he's not a career bureaucrat, and that's why we're going to be on the moon in 2024. And he'll be able to laugh at people who laughed at him, and he'll be able to laugh at them from the moon, because the entire death of NASA has been a long, horrible 3-decade decay. It's been like watching somebody waste away from cancer or tuberculosis. An agency that was once populated by engineers and test pilots became ever more populated by administrators, managers, and bureaucrats. Both space shuttle tragedies were the result of bureaucratic decision-making over what was clear to engineers anyway. And so to get a guy who, how can he run NASA? He has no government experience. I leave you to draw your own conclusions from this. The guy who runs NASA is not the guy who has to do the computations to get the capsule to the moon. The guy who runs NASA is going to be the guy who knows how to make this company and that company talk to each other in an amicable way with amicable rewards so that each company is building the very best thing that they are specialized in building and bringing private sector together in the initial phases. And I expect that if we do this the right way, and it seems so far like we are, that I expect that what will happen is simply this. NASA will become what NASA should be and should have been, which is an exploration agency. They should be handling, coordinating exploration. Jet Propulsion Laboratory, Johns Hopkins University are building terrific probes, and the exploration aspect of the solar system just can't be beaten. But what NASA will eventually become something like the FAA. And the FAA doesn't build airplanes. And the FAA, we don't buy tickets to travel from here to there by going through the FAA. The FAA regulates safety. It provides certain standards of safety. It provides certain areas of airspace that are deemed to be dangerous and so therefore are restricted. And the FAA basically allows commercial aviation to fly by administering a small set of rules. And that is what NASA is going to be. And I will close this long segment by saying this. Up until recently, and I mean probably the appointment of this recent NASA director, the result of NASA, and I've heard this from, 7 or 8 industry insiders, people who've actually flown into space or are building vehicles that fly into space. They said that up until very recently, NASA's job was to make sure that nobody got into space unless they flew with NASA. Their job was not just to be not just a gatekeeper. Their job was to be a guard to allow nobody into space that wasn't flying out of Boeing spaceships run by NASA out of Cape Canaveral. And now it looks like NASA's going back to its original purpose, which is to facilitate spaceflight, to do some pure research, and to mostly show people, here are the keys, get going, we'll get out of your way. And if we see somebody cheating, then we're going to have to come in and enforce some rules. But until then, knock yourselves out, kid.
They've gone from being the gatekeepers to the people that are overseeing the production of, in the long-term plan here, a craft called the Gateway that's going to be in orbit around the moon. Yes. So it was kind of a nice
space station. I have to say this. I know this is going to be an hour-long episode. I just have to say this. What the moon base that we're talking about, the presence on the moon, a significant portion of what that base will be was what the space station was supposed to be back when it was an American space station called Freedom under Ronald Reagan. But we decided once again, in this case of the space shuttle, which was originally designed to sit on the back of another jet, fly up to altitude, land, come back, refuel it. You could land it at LAX, you could land it in Orlando, land it anywhere you want to, refuel it and go. Congress continued to cut the budget on that. And so they had to build in all of these Band-Aids and made it worse and worse and worse, less and less effective, less cheap and less safe. The International Space Station was supposed to be a place where we could launch vehicles to the moon, to the planets, and so on. And somewhere somewhere around 2009 or so, at our previous home, I interviewed a current astronaut for NASA and asked him, why are we not launching vehicles from the space station into planetary orbits? And he said, well, we had to change the inclination of the orbit. The orbit's inclination is the tilt of the orbit, and all of the solar system lies in a single plane called the ecliptic. And if you're in this kind of a thing, to change that orbit to make it flat basically requires huge amounts of energy. And he said, yeah, our orbit is inclined too high. And that was news to me. It's like, what? He said, yeah, we can't really reach the ecliptic. We can't reach the other planets because the orbit is too tilted. Why is the orbit so tilted? He said, well, we had to increase the inclination of the space station's orbit so that the Russians could get to it, because Russia's launch system's further north than ours. And I literally asked this astronaut spokesman for NASA, I said, so in order to build the space station that was supposed to be a launching pad for the solar system, in order to build it, we had to modify its orbit so that it couldn't be used for its purpose. Did I understand that correctly? And he gave me one of these administrator looks, like, well,
if
yeah.
you say it that way.
If you say it that way, it doesn't really make much sense.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are glad that you've been with us on this journey, and we're looking forward to the stars and beyond. And it's always exciting to talk about these kind of things. And we know that our members at BillWhittle.com share our enthusiasm for everything that is outer space and space exploration. Thank you to the members for providing the funding that make this enterprise possible. And that group has been growing on a daily basis. The last 2 months have been the fastest growth that BillWhittle.com has had in a long time. So you've got a lot of new friends and neighbors there in the comments section, in the member-written blog, and in the video conferences that we're now doing for a select group of members. And by select, I mean those who select us rather than we select them. If you'd like to join, just go to BillWhittle.com and click that Become a Member link. We'll provide a link in the description below. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks for watching.